Welcome to On the Mark. I'm your host, Howard Mark Rubin. I am so excited to present this podcast series addressing our rapidly changing world and how it is affecting industries and people in unique and interesting ways. As John F. Kennedy once said, change is the law of life, and those who look only to the past or present are certain to miss the future. The business leaders and personalities who I will be interviewing in these podcasts certainly look to the future. And I hope you come away with information and inspiration that helps you adapt in both your business and personal lives. You can find these podcasts on all major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our website, getsplatzer.com. Welcome to another edition of On the Mark. And today we have with us Howard Schlesinger of VRF Solutions, LLC. Howard is a registered architect and real estate developer. He has extensive experience in the areas of property development and renovation. His expertise includes state-of-the-art renovations, building upgrades, and the redevelopment of underutilized properties for commercial and residential use. He's passionate about bringing health and wellness to the built environment, and he's currently a partner, as I mentioned, of VRF Solutions, a design-build firm focusing on heat pump technologies and a holistic approach to sustainable energy in our built environment. But we're going to focus on one area of what I think Howard's passionate about, and I have a passion about it, and I think it's something that has to be addressed more in our society and in our country, which is how do we deal with the housing crisis for the homeless, for the poor? How do we provide a safe environment for these people at an affordable cost? And something that I've always felt is that planning has been a problem in that we've built in New York City and some other places these huge housing projects where we housed thousands of poor people in one location. It didn't work out so well. When we look back at it, that there was a lot of crime and unsafe environments there. We've taken that. One thing I've looked at is in Co-op City, we've moved everyone in the Bronx to one section of the Bronx, and the rest of the Bronx, I think, suffered in its own development because of that. And in looking back, some of our decisions that were made were not the smartest decisions in terms of planning on how we're going to be housing people. And this is something that Howard's very passionate about. So, Howard, why don't you introduce yourself and then tell us a little bit what you think should be done generally in a planning sense for housing underprivileged or homeless people.
So thank you, Howard, for inviting me into the podcast. I really appreciate it. I've listened to a number of your podcasts. I recommend a lot of them because they're really good insights into how our market in real estate operates and what the opportunities are out there. Regarding where I sit in this environment, I come from the experience of having a firm of architecture for 10 years, then sold that and became more of an entrepreneurial person in all aspects of real estate development. And currently with VRF Solutions in a sustainable environment of energy and energy efficiency. So I combine all three into this. You bring up the idea of affordable housing, and that is a passion of mine. I've always felt that we have such opportunity to solve those kinds of problems. And I look back at what was going on in New York City over the past 25 years, starting with Bloomberg as our mayor and going through de Blasio and Adams and now Mondani with his ideas of how to do this. And what I looked for was common threads. What is it that each one of these leaders that we've had in front of us who looked at one of the most difficult issues in New York, in all the boroughs, affordable housing, a place where people could live, where they could sustain themselves, sustain the buildings, the owners can sustain managing and keeping the buildings in good shape while we keep increasing that number. And it's an interesting view that starting with Bloomberg, where he had an ambition to do very much what we're doing again today, he built to his record about 165,000 new units, new and renovated units. And then the numbers vacillated following 200 for de Blasio. Adams has, with his pipeline, over 400,000 units, if you consider his pipeline as something that will be realized. So, and now Mondani is coming in with an ambitious program of about 200,000 units. So it's very exciting that this chain, which has been going through kind of a golden thread, there's been different levels of success, a lot of controversy, certainly. And when you invited me into this podcast, you asked me what I'd like to talk about. And my core message that I wanted to talk about was collaboration. And I think that that word still resonates in this effort of housing, and particularly affordable housing. And something that everyone is always familiar with in the housing market, in any kind of initiative, is the idea of public private partnerships. Um, that seems to be one of the keys that resonates in all of our leaders since the turn of the century.
Can you explain to me what you consider to be a private um, public partnership? It seems to me, in my sense of it, it's that the housing or the projects are done privately, and the government is giving subsidies to mostly in this form of tax incentives to make it work. Is that what you see as a private public partnership, or is it something else in your mind?
Well, I would nuance that a little bit because as a developer, and I spent 18 years rescuing industrial properties and was in the public private partnership environment of raising funds, securing land, building parks, and having opportunities to serve the communities that I was developing in, while at the same time managing a investment team that was looking for a return on investment. And what I learned from the concept of public private partnership is that the goals of the public and the goals of the private sector are not completely aligned. And I created a term of art, if you will, to call it public private cooperation. And that's a little more accurate, I found, in that it's the goal of both parties, public and private, to reach a little bit and understand what it is that each party is really focused on. So, to the idea of what the public can offer, they offer the opportunity to build on land that they own. That's a great opportunity to take what is already owned and with incentives and tax incentives and other programs, provide that land with criteria. And that criteria can be affordable. And that affordable, if reasonable, to still create a return on investment for the private sector, who's motivated, I believe, by two things. One is to do good. They didn't go into the business just to make a lot of money off the backs of others. They went into the business because they saw they had a skill set to build community. And I think
All right,
developers really,
let me ask you something.
sure,
Um, when we talk about affordable housing, there
yes,
are different levels of affordable housing. There's affordable
absolutely.
housing for middle income people or lower middle income people. There is affordable housing for people who are homeless. There is affordable housing for people who have very little. Programs that have been used in the past, Section 8, where the government has given subsidies and the individuals find housing, and the government subsidizes sometimes 90% of the rent, sometimes 10% of the rent, depending on usually what their income is, how many people are there. And these programs exist with the housing that's there. A lot of times I've been involved in projects where there's a negotiation between the government and the builder. The government is saying, let us build this project, give us either better zoning rights or give us use of the land. And in return for that, we're going to take a portion of the project and use it for affordable housing for either seniors, which is a different category, or for lower income people. Now, I know in the
Mhm.
outer boroughs, and I think what a lot of builders prefer is to do senior type of housing rather than low income housing because it's more acceptable in the community. A lot of communities push back and they say, "Well, we don't want a big group of homeless people or low income people in our neighborhood. It's going to make our real estate values go down. It's going to make the neighborhood less safe." How do you address those type of issues, and how do we find housing for the people that are the least desirable? I'll call them for the neighborhoods themselves, for the I don't know, call them the better neighborhoods, the more established neighborhoods, and to accept that type of housing in their area.
So, first of all, you raised a lot of really good points about what is affordable housing. And going back, as I shared in the history of how it's been looked at, different leaders of our city government have defined that in different ways. So I'm going to take a shot at what is housing really solving here. And if you look at it from an economic standpoint, the housing or the lack of housing results in people living on the street.
Right.
That turns out to be economically the most expensive place for people to be for our support systems because the people on the street show up in our hospitals and so on and so forth. And that's very expensive. The policing of the people that are on the street, very expensive. And there's a lot of statistics for this, which we can talk about on another day. But then the next level up are the shelters, where the shelters try to bring these people off the street and on a temporary basis become a conduit to something possibly more permanent. There's a lot of issues.
But I've heard, and I think this is true, that a lot of people would rather be on the streets than in some of these shelters. They feel safer on the streets. That because
It's
some of the
you,
shelters are so
you're
horrific that
what
they
you've
don't want to
heard
be in
is
those.
absolutely true. I also have the experience. I've been on the board of Housing and Services, which is a nonprofit for supportive housing. So beyond the shelters, the next step up is what's called supportive housing. And as you do supportive housing, which takes into account Section 8 and other revenue streams that come from government, these people wind up in these, what we call supportive housing, with permanent housing. The key to permanent housing to blend into neighborhoods is that it also has social services built in to the system. So where the street doesn't have any real social services, the shelters also don't really do more than just have a stepping stone to either get back on the street or to some other possible way that they could survive. And some of them run very well and take care of families and do an excellent job. I've been to many of them, and there are owners that really you could literally eat off the floor. They are in such good shape and they are so well run. And then there's everything you could think of after that. But the goal of a lot of these people to get into something where they can count on roof over their head. And as Maslow's law indicates, you want to have shelter and food before you go to the next level. So supportive housing is one of the tools in that space. And then beyond that, you get to affordable housing.
Well, let me ask you
So
something else. There's another
sure.
category that I don't know how that fits in, but I know that New York City was using hotels to house the homeless and and they would actually rent rooms. I mean, the Martinique Hotel was a famous example. I'm paying a fortune to house people in these hotels. Has that stopped, or is that something that's still part of these programs to use hotels to house these people at what seems to be very high rates?
Well, there's two answers to that, actually, Howard. One is that when there was this extreme influx of immigrants trying to find a place to be, and many of them were shipped into New York as an example. And the Roosevelt Hotel and other hotels were taken over by the city government with a program to pay for those rooms 24/7, 365 days a year. And the owners of those hotels were doing very well. But there was no real support. And Roosevelt, one that I'm very familiar with and was involved with, walked the halls of that place. They did a pretty decent job trying to process people through to get them jobs and so on and so forth. Politics took over, and that processing is done. As far as a housing solution, the second idea, I think that still exists because it's properties that are not functioning, can be taken over by the government for whatever reason, and can service. I know two hotels that are working very well in that space, taking care of families, having day programs for their children so that they can go out and work. Um, and they're very nice, and they're in Queens, and they do a fabulous job providing a very reasonable space for the housing solution for people that are on the edge of society. They work, they have work programs, there's job offerings all over the halls to get people to get jobs. So the use of the hotel is just a tool. It's not a program. And I think it's a good idea when hotels aren't able to survive in the conditions they used to be. So going back to where I was, the affordable solutions take into account a very interesting hybrid. And HSI, the organization that I've been involved with, and many other organizations, we're not alone in this at all, which is the good news, built in the Bronx 2 years ago. We put up a 13-story building for 106 units, and it has a beautiful lobby shared by both affordable and supportive housing tenants. And it's got all of the facilities, the services, and meeting rooms and so on, and some green areas. And it blends right into the neighborhood along the Grand Concourse and is an enhancement to the neighborhood. So it's really how it's presented, how it gets executed, how it's blended into the community, working closely back to the PPC, if you will, cooperation idea, and with professionals who bring care and concern to the neighborhoods these facilities are brought to. It can be an enhancement, not an impediment to the betterment of those neighborhoods.
So let me ask. Let's go a little bit. I don't want to get into politics too much, uh,
No, that's
but
good.
there's not. But we've had in New York a migrant influx
Hmm.
from what's going on in all parts of the country, and New York City, as well as many other cities throughout the country, have been inundated with people that need housing and jobs and food and all the social services that are needed. And there's a lot of political pushback in people saying, or some people saying that, hey, these are not people that should be here. Why should my tax dollars go to support these people? And I shouldn't be having to pay for their housing and their medical care and everything else. So, and from a housing perspective, how do you think that we should be dealing with this influx of people who are here? Some people would say illegally. Some people would say they're migrants that deserve a better life. But how do you think that we should deal with this, knowing our present political climate, that we're limited in what we can do? How would you deal with that?
I think you did a really good job of saying that you don't want to talk about politics, and you brought in
No,
the third rail of politics. So I'll answer you this way. I think from a uh, humanity standpoint, we all want to help everyone we can. And then there's a great story that was told by the guy that was the SEAL that was caught after Bin Laden was taken out and his helicopter crashed. And he lectures about this, but his team asked him in the basement when half of his transportation to get away was gone, "What do we do now?" And his answer resonated. We do what's in our reach. So, from an answer to your question, I think we do what's within our reach. We can't solve everything everywhere, but we can solve what's within our reach. And that's why I joined you on this program. I think you do a great job within your reach to reach out to people that can do something. And we're trying to do something here. So, in the ability to house people that are challenged with housing, we should do whatever we can within our reach. And the larger political issues that are out there are not in my reach. So I don't tackle that necessarily, but I do participate in HSI. I do participate in helping these buildings that we have, stock that we already have, whether it's the hotels, as you referred to, or underutilized properties or properties owned by our government. Maybe there's ways we can bring those into the fold of providing the housing and the services needed to make these communities and neighborhoods function well.
But
So,
going back to the public-private partnership that you were talking
sure,
about, um, do you agree with me that really the partnership, to the extent it's a partnership, is the government? They're not building the housing; they're
correct.
private sector's doing that. Is that the issue? Is how much tax incentives that the private sector is getting for building these houses? Because is the government doing? Is the government going to identify who should be housing there, or do we give priorities? I think in the shelters, to get out of the shelter, families get priorities over a single male, for instance. And maybe citizens or people who are here with green cards get priority over people who are migrants. There are priorities in terms of setting those priorities. Is that the government's job, or is that the private sector's job? Is the private sector just to do the building, or who's doing the the, the who's making the decisions on how these programs should be operated?
I feel you're leaning back into the political answers, and that kind of judgment, and it is a judgment call, uh, is to me a collaboration. And I wouldn't put the onus on either the public or the private sector, but rather on the results that can be taken care of. And if you can build a building that has the ability to deal with all aspects of what you were just talking about, then let's work together to find those solutions together. To put the onus on a dictum from either party, I don't think supports the idea of what we are as a society, which is a a mass of people trying to find ways to work together to make it better for everyone involved in that community. And it takes a government effort and it takes a private effort to do that. So, in the private side of it, the private, even though there are incentives, and incentives come in all different colors and shades and forms. So there's ways of creating that can help the private sector meet their return on investment need because they're in this to be able to survive and make and also provide for their families. Not all developers are super wealthy people building towers. Most developers are small family businesses that are trying to make ends meet by keeping their facilities working. And that's a critical part of that. So if the public sector steps in to help that initiative, that they are trying to make their life around the idea that they are giving people a place to live, That's a good idea. The balancing act is in the collaboration between the two. But the private sector is really bringing a lot of the money, the finance, to be able to put these buildings together, whether they're renovations or new construction. And they take the risk in the end of the day. On the short term of getting these things built, getting them approved, getting them out of the ground, getting them all the way through to maintaining them so that they're reasonable for the future of themselves, the family, and the families they are providing housing for. And then what they bring, which is really special and is very much the purview of the private sector, is innovation. They are motivated to be able to get the most efficient CapEx answer to building these facilities while providing something that is sustainable. And that's the other side of this. And I want to just bring that into our conversation because there's great opportunity in the existing facilities that are out there. The Adams City of Yes was a great idea to make it easier for the zoning conversions of commercial property into residential. And that idea is a great idea and it applies in certain places. As an architect, I understand it's very much a physical reality as well as a financial cost. But from a financial cost, very often leaving something in place saves you a tremendous amount of process getting something approved to be built. All the materials that you have to bring to a site, much of it structurally is there. It's the infrastructure, maybe the envelope, the facades of the building that you need to modify to meet the systems necessary to make it into housing. But it's a really good idea. It's been adopted. It's not brand new, but I think that in the new administration, there's a lot of interest in moving in that direction, as well as building new facilities. But the idea of sustainability is the long view. And there's a lot of initiative and a lot of technology in the private sector that can help these kinds of new housing facilities. Call it shelters. I'm not eliminating shelters. It serves a purpose, but it is a purpose of transitioning the people that are stuck on the street, get them off the street. Nobody on the street that I've spoken to, and I happen to be in a seat of speaking to many of those people, want to be in a shelter. They want to get from the street to a permanent place where they could actually have a key. That's what we give people when HSI brings somebody in. They get a key. The symbolism and the reality of that is a very big deal.
So
And
I spoke before when I at the beginning
yes,
of the low income housing in past planning, going back 20, 30, 40 years, has always been
mhm,
to build big developments where you put
yeah,
all these people because they'd have a lot of units. They'd be able to do that. The
hmm,
projects that seems to have been, in my mind, discredited to some extent. It ended up forming, particularly in a lot of situations, unsafe environments where there was drugs. There was a lot of the crime rates were much higher, and the trend now seems to be smaller developments that are more integrated into the community. Do you agree with that? Do you think
I
there's a
totally
place
agree with
for,
that.
is there a place for these large developments anymore, or have they been a mistake? Do you think they were a mistake in planning?
I think scale has to do with services. I think that what was done before was an idea that was started back in the turn of the century of a tower in a park, and you put a lot of people in a particular location, thousands, surrounded by a park, and the services were beyond that. That's not a good idea. And for those of you in this world of knowing that history, Pruitt-Igoe was an example of that. That was actually blown up and replaced because it didn't work. Um, I think that scale of the number of people has to be balanced with the scale of the services that are included in a community. And that includes where they play, where they work, where they get their food and shop, uh, and then where they live. Incorporating that in some creative ways goes into the private and public cooperation of coming up with ideas to provide the zoning to do it, which is different from the zoning we currently have.
Right.
We segregated a lot of things, manufacturing. Uh, a good example of what's starting to transform is the garment industry. It lived in Midtown Manhattan. It's gone. The buildings are there. Do we have the ability to take the next step and rezone that, as is currently in motion, to provide that as neighborhood and turn that into another West Village or Upper West Side?
I don't think that's so much of a zoning issue. I think the city of yes, as you refer to, as a lot of people refer to it, they're very flexible as to the zoning. I don't think they really have a zoning issue. I think the problem is, do you knock these buildings down, which would be a huge project, or can you convert them for residential use because they're really not set up, and there's only I know from my experience in my practice that taking these buildings and trying to convert a B or C, which most of these garment center buildings are B or C class buildings, into residential, doesn't always work. It's just too expensive. It just doesn't make sense. So where it does work, I think it's a great idea, and we should be doing that. And we have services, within Manhattan. There are usually services. It's convenient in terms of transportation, but it's not going to be enough unless the public sector is going to do a lot of subsidy of this. And I know you keep on talking about this partnership. I don't see it as a partnership. I know it's called as a partnership. What I see it as is a negotiation. A private
Mm-hmm.
builder who has to make money. He's there to make money, and he says, "I can't afford to do this and make money unless you're going to give me certain things." The zoning is almost a given. What they need is tax breaks, tax incentives. They need subsidies, and that's what they're negotiating with the government. I don't. While it's very nice to say partnership, I see it more as a negotiation. Which how much can the private sector get from the public sector, and that'll make it for them to build. That's how I view it. I don't know if you agree with me.
I do agree with you. And that's why I, as a developer, for the years that I was doing it, and I was in the environment of PPPs, public private partnerships, and I found very early on that putting that together was a PPC, a public private collaboration. Collaboration is a negotiation.
Okay,
It is negotiating the goals and the values of the members in that room to come up with a common goal that they could both satisfy their internal needs. And that's collaboration. It takes negotiation, but negotiation is listening to the person in front of you and satisfying what they absolutely have to have so that you can have both parties advance.
right,
And that takes a lot of work and a lot of listening. But with that, I was able to build community. And I think there are ways to do that. It didn't come without challenges and compromise to be able to get that to happen. But that's the business we're all in, and that's what's within our reach. We can, if we have the common goal of let's address the affordable housing, whether it's under the headings we just talked about, which is supportive and shelter and as we define all the way to market, how do we build all that into a community that we can support, and how do we afford to do that? And that's why I was leading into the technology.
okay,
The technology that we have now to build is evolving rapidly. Everybody is talking about AI and how AI is taking over our world and removing our jobs and all of that. And I see it from a different perspective. I see technology under that heading of a better pencil. And I use the metaphor of a pencil because I'm an architect. So I actually started with a chisel and a stone, but as it evolved, it turned into this amazing ability to really transform environments through technology. And there's computer drafted buildings now that are really being built and much more efficiently, much faster. Time is money. There are ways to do this and to allow for these kinds of technologies to happen. And so, back to the internal nature of the stock that we currently have and the new buildings we're building, what's very important is to put in sustainable, affordable systems into these facilities that then long term can continue to operate. And right now, what we have is unsustainable systems that are failing, steam systems, fuel based. And it's not to eliminate, although there's legislation out there to eliminate gas in smaller buildings that are going up. That may or may not be the best idea because gas may still have a purpose. But the idea of using the energy we have for things like heat pumps, which is pervasively all over Europe and Asia, is compared to 70, 80, 90% in those areas. America sits with 9% of that technology.
And how about, in the same vein, the use of module housing? Do you think that's going to become more prevalent?
I do.
I know you're an
I do.
architect,
I
you like
think
to
I
build
think
your own things, but I think
I
module
totally
housing,
do, Howard. I think that that to me is a technology.
right?
There's a lot of pushback because the unions have been building a certain way for forever. The engineers, the structural engineers, the all of the infrastructure that goes into building a building is different when you get into modular.
Mhm.
So, is that a bad thing? Can we transform into something that may be more efficient? That's where the cooperation comes in on the private sector. And that's where collaboration is so important. We need to start building up the next workforce to be able to adapt and adopt those kinds of new technologies. So there's still jobs out there, but they're different. And the efficiency of the new technologies, be it heat pumps, be it facades that create electricity within the building, so you don't have a strain on our grid. There are now surfaces that could be the panels in windows and in physical surfaces of buildings that generate a monicum of electricity. But if we put our attention to that, it doesn't have to be a monicum of electricity. Look what happened to the car industry.
Mhm.
When our attention got into the car industry and did batteries, which is where it started in the first place. But the oil and gas industry said, no, no, let's make them oil and gas driven machines. And that became our world. Now it's shifting. It'll eventually move more toward that. Do batteries take oil and gas to make a battery? Yes. So it's just shifting the systems.
Not only does it take oil and gas to make the battery, when the batteries are at the end of their useful life, the
There are
disposal,
also a
what it does
contamination
to the
issue.
environment, right? So there's other issues with batteries. They're not necessarily uh, the best solution in every situation. And how do you charge these batteries? Well, using fossil fuel to charge the batteries, and then you have a problem with the disposal with the contamination. I'm not so sure we have it down right yet.
Yeah, Howard, I don't think there's a panacea in any of this. We're an evolving system. But the best example I have is the telegraph. And you take the telegraph, and the telegraph became a wired system, and
Yeah,
the wired system became a wireless system, and the wireless system became a smartphone, and the smartphone became a computer in your pocket.
right.
And when you look at that transition and you look at the built industry and you look at how we built back at the turn of the century and before that, that diagram isn't that different. at the moment. But there's tremendous technology to transform it. And if we put our attention to it, we could have housing built the same way we build the technology of a computer in our pocket. And it's using that as a metaphor to move that forward is where we sit in our ability. Now it is our, and I will say PPP or PPC, to agree that that's a good idea.
All right,
The
so let me ask
financial
you,
interest and
I'm sorry, we're getting to the end now, but I want
okay,
to ask you
yes, sure.
a question. If you were president or king
Oh wow, no.
or the total decision maker, name the things that you would do if you could do this unilaterally, that you would do to try to fix the housing crisis that we have in New York and the country. What do you think the most important things that we have to do?
I'm going to start with collaboration. I think that there's a lot of very smart people out there that have as their primary issue, how do we, as you phrase it, solve the housing issue? And I think that if we were to believe that we could solve it and put people in a room, I have run think tanks like that for health and wellness in the built environment, and it works. And there's a lot of very smart people doing exactly this that just need a voice. And so the specifics of a solution, which I think is what you're really getting at,
Right.
the do I have the magic wand? And I'll close with this. I was solving on an environmental problem, a very significant issue on a 14-acre site. And it got very deep because we were pouring millions of dollars into the dirt. And there were a lot of questions involved. And I was being introduced to a insurance company, uh, one of the largest without being named, and the principals of that company to see if we could solve this problem. And 9 of us got on a phone call, not a video. This was a phone call. And I hadn't met any of the insurance people because that was the key right now. And the person that was leading the team got on the phone and said to me this: what would you do if you had a magic wand? And I didn't have a lot of time because we were on a purpose of getting this problem solved. I didn't have a lot of time to play that. But what I answered with is I would make everything I encounter better. And what that manifested in was all the solutions necessary to then go ahead and solve the problem and develop, because everybody got on that page. Everybody in that room got on the page. We're going to make this better. That was the mission. And to solve the housing problem, I think we have the same mission. Everybody should get a magic wand and see what they could do within their reach to make it better. Because there are tools, absolutely, whether it's technology or incentives from the government or land or creative ways to bring all of this together. It's a holistic view. We can make it better. We can solve the problem. And all we need is a commitment to being intentional about doing it.
Well, I think that's a great goal. I think that there's got to be a political uh, collaboration also,
Mm-hmm.
and that just, as long as this becomes stays a political hot potato, uh, it's going to be difficult to come up with the collaboration you're talking about or the solutions that we're talking about. But Howard, I want to thank you for being on the mark. I think it was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
I think
Likewise.
I,
Thank you
I
for
think it
having me.
gave I think it gave people a lot of things to think about. I don't think we solved anything here today, but at least we discussed issues that I think people have to discuss more and see what works. So thank you for being
If I
on the
can say
mark.
one more thing to that, Howard,
Yes,
uh, this was our first conversation on a forum like this.
right.
I do believe that this is a great forum to have this kind of conversation. The first one is to lay out what's in front of us. The subsequent ones are to lay out how we can solve and point at the particular problems to then tackle each one as a sizable solution that can be addressed.
Okay, and I hope that we have a chance to address that
Great.
and go with this further. So thank you for being on the mark, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thank you.
Very much so, Howard. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of On the Mark. I started this podcast by quoting John F. Kennedy and would like to end it with quoting one of my favorite baseball players, Nolan Ryan. Enjoying success requires the ability to adapt. Only by being open to change will you have a true opportunity to get the most from your talent. I wish you success in staying ahead of the curve instead of behind the 8 ball. Thank you for tuning in.